Hey everybody, welcome to today's edition of Bad Analogy Theater. This time, sourcing documents. This is going to be a walkthrough of a presentation that was meant to be a live video with me cooking and stuff, but that hasn't happened yet. So we're just going to do it this way. So we're going to start. What is sourcing? So sourcing is the meat and potatoes of historical analysis. This is where you kind of demonstrate that you understand the nature of making history. And we make history based on primary sources who were there hundreds of years ago to see these events, since we don't have a time machine and we can't do it. But those sources were created by people. And look, if you haven't had a long chat about this idea, the nonsense that there's any such thing as unbiased news or whatever, like, let's just make it clear, we all have unconscious biases, and that's built on the point of view we have, as people, and what we believe and what we value, and how our culture informs our outlook on life, and just what kind of personality we have, and all that stuff. Okay, and so when we're doing source analysis for the DBQ in AP World History, we're explaining how the specific characteristics of the creator and the document that was created can be seen in the evidence itself. Okay, and it's that simple. It's a quick analysis breaking down, hey, this is what the source is, or who it was created by, and what they were doing, and here's how we can see that expressed in the document, or here's why that happened. Okay, you're not telling the reader whether or not the source is biased. You're not even really judging credibility per se, although that can come into it. But biased, don't ever use the word biased when you're doing sourcing, because that's just understood. There's no reason to even say that. Okay. And so when we're doing sourcing in the DBQ, the four criteria or the four characteristics that College Board wants you to analyze come from historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point of view. Okay, so these are the four things that you are looking for in the document, and we'll talk more about that later. So when you do this in the DBQ, it can look something like this. This is just one sentence frame you can try. We'll look at some examples later on for some other ways to do it. Because the source is something from HIPP, so because the source's intended audience was blank, you just describe what it is. And this may be where you read into it, or where you demonstrate that you understand who or what or why the HIPP was there, right? They would say something from the document. Okay, this might be a time where you quote very small parts of a document. When you're using evidence, you should never quote for evidence. Here, if the words they say really matter, then you might quote. Otherwise, you're still paraphrasing here. They would say something in order to do this, right? And that this last part for sure is you explaining your historical understanding of the source and the part of HIPP that you chose to use. So, for an example, because the government officials' purpose was to warn their king, they would say the enemy was incredibly strong in order to keep their country safe. Okay? Now, you notice it would have been real easy for me to say they may have exaggerated the account or whatever, but I don't need to do that. I am just explaining the purpose of the document and the impact it has on the evidence from the document. Okay? And this is just one very blasé example, okay? We'll look at some more examples. But first, let's do bad food analogies. And we'll start with historical situation. And we're going to start with a potato. Everybody loves a potato, right? So, we cut them up. We put some sort of heat source on it. And the outcome really depends on what heat source we surround that potato with. Okay? So we know if we fry it, we're going to get French fries. If we boil it, it's just this soft, mushy, maybe mealy potato that we mash up, probably with butter and milk and sour cream and cheese and chives and salt and pepper. A lot of stuff to make it good. But the French fry is just so good with salt. If you roast it, right, if you smash it and cook it in a pan, it all depends on what surrounds the potato. And so when we compare this to historical situation, the historical situation are the times and events and people and places and authorities and governments that surround the source, right? So when we analyze this in an essay, we're going to talk about those surrounding factors and talk about how that then affects the end result of the document, because you're going to get a different document depending on the circumstances under which the document was created, right? All right. So potatoes and historical situation. Intended audience. Okay, so take a zucchini, right? It's the weirdly shaped green things that I would have to imagine most kids look at and they're like, what am I supposed to do with that, right? But adults, maybe there are adults who actually like it, and you can just real simply grill it or broil it and give them a plank of zucchini and they'll eat it, right? But if you're going to serve that to kids, most likely kids are going to get grated zucchini in some sort of alternative form. Zucchini tot, zucchini bread, maybe zucchini pancakes or a fritter, okay? But you kind of, I know as a cook, I would try to hide the zucchini, right? Because if people are weirded out by food they don't normally eat, or kids are like, I don't want to eat that thing, right? Then you find a way to hide it in something, okay? So again, you think about the audience and you modify the veg to fit the audience you're presenting it to or giving it to, right? So you guys probably know what code switching is, even if you've never heard the term, because depending on where you are and who you're talking to, your demeanor and behavior probably changes. You probably don't act the same around your friends as you do in front of a teacher, okay? And that's another way to think about intended audience. All right, the first P, this is purpose. So let's say we make cake batter, okay? Well, cake batter can be cooked in a lot of different forms, and so you think about, why am I making this cake? What am I going to do with it? So for a wedding, of course, you're going to fancy it up. You're going to make a bunch of different layers. You're going to cover it completely, maybe even in fondant. Maybe you're going to shape it to make some kind of goofy scene or whatever, because, it's a wedding, right? That's what you do. If it's just like for the family and you don't really care what it looks like, you're going to throw it in one of those big Pyrex pans, bake it, slap some frosting on the top, and you don't even care what the frosting looks like, because, sometimes you just got to have cake, right? For the family. And then if you're making a kids party, maybe you just want them to decorate their own, right? So you make cupcakes and you give them all a cupcake and you throw out a bunch of different flavors of frosting and a bunch of sprinkles and a bunch of stupid toppings. But the form it takes, the end product, depends on why you're making it. Okay, and so again, when we look at sources, you're gonna, if you're the creator of that source, you are gonna alter what you say in the source or how you say it, depending on why you're making it. And sometimes your purpose may determine what is also not in a document, right? There are words that don't enter your vocabulary if you're talking to an old person or let's just be honest, you're not going to talk to a boomer with the same words you would talk to a teenager. Okay, that's purpose, and it's a little intended audience as well. But if you're trying to sound fancy, you talk differently. Okay, so why are you doing it? All right, our last thing here, the second P, point of view. Okay, I love cheese. I think most people probably like cheese. Some people are lactose intolerant and they don't like cheese, right? So when we talk about how you view the food, we could talk about diets, and really there's only one split on this one, I think. Keto people love cheese because they're all about fat and they're all about not carbs. And so instead of, making a taco shell out of cornmeal or out of flour, they make taco shells out of cheese, so they're not ingesting carbs. Most diets on the planet would look at that and say, no way, that's so many calories and it's all like dairy and fat. wouldn't touch it, right? So again, point of view is your outlook on the world, often shaped by the beliefs and values that you have, which is, of course, the culture of a person. And so the way you see things impacts how you talk about them. If you give three people from three different cultures the same situation to describe, they're going to highlight different things from each situation depending on what they value or the way they see the world. So when you do point of view analysis on a document, you're looking for a point of view that you sort of understand or know enough about the history of to give this sort of analysis, to use that to explain why they emphasize the things that they emphasized. Okay, so 3 steps to sourcing. First, you want to identify the documents that have a clear, interesting, easy to analyze source. Okay, in the normal years, you would have 7 documents. You would need to source 3 of them. This year, you have 5 documents, and you only need to analyze 2 of those documents, right? And you only have to analyze one part of HIPP out of those 2 documents. So you pick the ones that strike you as being something you know enough about to source, that are interesting to talk about. Okay. And obviously when you're picking HIPP, a lot, sometimes they're going to overlap and you could talk about more than one, because purpose and intended audience, even when I was explaining the bad analogy, like there's clear crossover there, right? Your historical situation goes a long way to determine what your point of view might be. Okay. But just pick one that you feel most comfortable talking about. Second, look for things in the document that are going to prove what you know about the HIPP, right? So if you know that the intended audience is this, find a phrase or find something from the document that helps you show they said something for that intended audience in a way that intended audience would understand. We're going to have an example of this in just a bit. And then finally, you're going to explain the relationship between whichever part of HIPP you chose and the document and the evidence itself. Okay, and that's what you'll write down. So let's look at some examples. These are from the 2018 release DBQ. First, this document was written by high caste Indians who, despite having a Western education and being at the top of the Hindu social structure, were feeling the effects of railroads. In this case, they're analyzing point of view. They're talking to us about how a high caste Indian would feel. That's their social status. That's who they are. That's point of view analysis. As depicted in document 2 by a Qing dynasty official likely to convince the government to industrialize and adapt new technologies like the Japanese had. Look, it's a first draft. Wording sometimes gets away from kids. This person was cramming a lot of stuff into one sentence, so pardon the awkwardness, but they did what they needed to do. They're talking about the purpose or intended audience, right? Because they're trying to convince a government official to industrialize. That's purpose. And, the document doesn't say that that's what they're trying to do, but this student understood the Qing well enough to know that, hey, they were falling behind the rest of the world, so that's probably what this document is up to. And then finally, for the 2018, as shown in document 5, written by an English politician likely to encourage British military action and expansion in East Asia to prevent Russian domination. Again, this is purpose, right? What are they trying to do here? And you notice on this one, the last 2 actually, they don't actually even bring up anything out of the document necessarily, but it clearly demonstrates that they understand what the document was trying to do. All right, 2 more examples. This is from the 2019. So this particular advice given to the Calicut ruler is influenced by the growing power of the Portuguese and demonstrates the fear Muslim merchants had that their power and influence was waning. This is historical situation. Okay, it's describing what was happening in the region. This rising power of the Portuguese, the waning influence of Muslim merchants, and just points out this influenced the advice that they gave. All right, and our last one. However, when Barbosa claims that there are very few of the Muslim merchants remaining today, he is influenced by his desire to keep his job as a government official and probably felt obligated to tell what his ruler wanted to hear. Purpose and an intended audience. If you get a government official talking to a ruler, understand half the time they're likely trying to just keep their job. Because it's true of every government official. It's true of every government official in 2020, right? Okay, so let's look at a couple documents to end this on and talk about how we might source the document itself. Okay, so this is a document from the director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency in 1960, and it was a message sent via diplomatic telegram to a CIA agent in the Congo. And in this document, pretty much says that if we let this guy hold office, Congo is going to turn into another Cuba. And of course, if you know the 1960s, you know that we're rapidly approaching the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro allows the Soviets to move missiles in, and we were like seconds away from the entire world blowing up. And all that automatically makes me start thinking about historical situation. You know, what is going on in 1960 with the U.S. and in the world? It's the Cold War, right? And what do I know about that historical situation is that the director of a government agency that's supposed to gather information and act against enemies of the United States, they're automatically going to see communists as evil or bad, and they're going to try to oppose them in any way they can. So when he's calling for the removal of the leader of another country, it's happening in the historical situation of the Cold War, and that's how that influences it. If there was anything else we might want to look at on this one, we might look at point of view of Alan Dulles as well, being an American, and how he views communism in other countries. Might be able to work. I don't think this is a strong one for intended audience or purpose, so I would definitely do point of view or historical situation on this one. All right, and last thing. Second practice is a much shorter document. This is from a landowner and major political leader in Mexico to the leader of the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata, in 1914. And this is where language we would definitely want to use. So the owners of large estates have legal rights. It is not possible to take away their property and give it to those who do not have legal title to the property. This land distribution business is absurd. Tell me which estates you now have control of and wish to redistribute that do not indeed legally belong to someone else. All right, Carranza is a landowner. He's a wealthy dude, and he thinks the idea of taking land from rich people and giving it to poor people in Mexico is absurd. And so this is either point of view or maybe purpose. And I would absolutely want to say, that he is, ridiculing the idea of land reform because he's a rich landowner. And who would land reform hurt the most? Rich landowners. Okay? And so this is probably point of view analysis. I mean, the purpose might have been just to tell Zapata that he's an idiot. So we might be able to go that route as well. But yeah, definitely point of view, maybe purpose on this document. And so that's document sourcing in a nutshell. Again, the analogies are meant to kind of help you understand what each part of HIPP is meant to do. And from there, it's just as simple as breaking it down, using your understanding of history, your historical reasoning skills to describe and analyze how one aspect of HIPP influences the source that is in the DBQ. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, leave comments on the video, or if you're one of my students, shoot me an email and we can discuss further.